Good afternoon and a warm welcome to the Thought Leadership Event Series number 22. In this series, we proudly present talks by Western Sydney University researchers whose work aligns with the United Nations Sustainable Development Goals, also known as SDGs, celebrating our number one ranking for commitment to SDGs in the Times Higher Education Index for an unprecedented 3 years in a row. Dr. Lucy Nicholas will present today's topic, Masculinity, Backlash and Antifeminism. In this session, Dr. Lucy Nicholas will explore into the changes in contemporary masculinity and the concerning public resurgence of reactionary misogyny, particularly in online spaces. They will explore how academic frameworks can help us comprehend these phenomena, including the emotional and ideological drivers behind them, the impacts and the strategies for resistance. With a diverse academic background, Dr. Lucy Nicholas earned their PhD from the University of Edinburgh and has since built a distinguished career spanning institutions from the University of Portsmouth to their current position in Australia. They have exhibited an intense dedication to teaching, covering a wide array of subjects including sociology, social and political theory, gender and sexualities, and academic skills. Dr. Lucy Nicholas is the esteemed author of 2 influential books. Their first book, Queer Postgender Ethics, published by Palgrave Macmillan in 2014, examines the intersections of gender, sexuality, and ethics. Their second book, The Persistence of Global Masculinism, co-authored with Dr. Chris Agius, was published in 2018, shedding light on the intricate dynamics of masculinity in a global context. Currently, Dr. Lucy Nicholas is engaged in 2 streams of research, one focusing on sexuality and gender diversity, and the other on men, masculinity, and violence prevention. With their expertise and dedication to advancing knowledge in gender and sexuality studies, Dr. Lucy Nicholas continues to make significant contributions to academia and beyond. Please welcome Dr. Lucy Nicholas. Over to you, Lucy.
Thank you so much, Badra. I am delighted to be here today. And I particularly am delighted to be here with the library because my first job out of university was, in fact, at the university library. And I had the best time. So, and I'd just like to start by acknowledging that I'm on Wurundjeri land today, and acknowledge that sovereignty was never ceded, and this always was and always will be Aboriginal land. And that, I acknowledge the great wisdom of Indigenous communities, and in particular around gender relations, and a great history of gender diversity in Indigenous cultures also. So, what I want to talk to you about today is one stream of my research, but I consider my research to kind of cohesively make sense as a whole thing. I've always been really interested in gender generally, and gender in terms of the problems that it creates. So the way that gender currently is has not worked for me in my life, and I've experienced a lot of things as a result of gender dynamics. So whether that's violence or the rigid norms of gender that don't work for me and lots of other people around me, be they assigned male or female at birth, gender just seems to create a lot of issues. So that's something that I've always been interested in. But the particular thing I want to talk to you about today is a kind of bunch of research I've been doing since around 2017. I've increasingly been really interested in the contemporary landscape of masculinities. And in particular, I'm really interested in this kind of, it's being called a resurgence, right, of misogynistic ideas. But I'm really interested in the ways that those ideas are underpinned by a kind of ethic in society, like a way of thinking in society that allows for misogyny and allows for men's violence. So this all started with the book Persistence of Global Masculinism in 2017 with my work wife, Chris, who I shared an office with at Swinburne University. And we realized that we were both using the same concept in different contexts. And that was the concept of masculinism. And it wasn't very cool anymore. It'd been kind of popular in the 80s, and then it was seeing a bit of a resurgence in international relations. We realized, though, that this was a really good concept for understanding the gendered dynamics of contemporary society, not just how people are doing gender individually, but the more structural aspects of how we have gendered ideologies, I guess, in society. From there, we then undertook a kind of empirical study about the overlaps between gender, masculinity, masculinism, and right-wing extremism. And that was in the state of Victoria. And then from there, I've kind of been doing a lot of work around men's behaviour change. I think that's a really interesting and important way of considering how to actually address these problems. And I think academics can sometimes, myself included, look at the problems, analyse the problems, present the problems. And I've had undergrad students be really vocal before saying, sociology is so depressing. We just look at all the issues, we diagnose all the issues. And I think it's really important to have change-oriented research. And for a long time, I didn't. I did a lot of theory. So I've become much more interested in thinking about what's really going on underneath these problems and how we can therefore address them. And I think men's behaviour change practitioners are really inspirational in that way. So these are the kind of background contexts of what I want to talk about today. But the kind of topic is around the changes in masculinity, the present landscape of men and masculinity in contemporary societies, in particular in so-called Australia. And I think I want to challenge some of the more polemical kind of narratives that we hear around men and masculinities. And I think it's really easy for complex ideas to be reduced down to sound bites and for us to take them as truisms and then not be able to really address the problem in a nuanced way. So firstly, I'm going to present to you some of the work done in masculinity studies and some of the discourses that we also see in popular discourse around young men. As part of this, I also really want to make sure to cover some of the work I found really inspirational from other scholars who have been doing incredible work, a lot of them in Australia. There's some incredible masculinity scholars in Australia who I just want to shout out as well, who have been really inspirational. So I want to present the kind of discourses that we see around young men and masculinity and how they often collapse into like extreme positions. Then I want to think about how that shapes how we see the problem of the contemporary manosphere or the online kind of resurgence of misogyny. And then think about some more nuanced ways of thinking about that near the end. So I guess one of the narratives that we've seen emerge in the last 20 years or so, so when I was first teaching at Portsmouth, we talked a lot about this idea that masculinity was becoming increasingly inclusive, increasingly positive, I guess. So one of the key works in this area was Eric Anderson's Inclusive Masculinity, which has since been critiqued, which is a healthy thing in academia. But there is a kind of truism, I guess, that young men are in some ways more in touch with their emotions, challenging some of those more traditional aspects of masculinity. So the cover image of this book shows two men touching and being intimate. And the argument of Anderson was that he thinks men are more able to have those kind of connections now. Other more contemporary research, specifically out of Australia, finds some similar findings as that. So Brittany Ralph, whose book Destabilizing Masculinism, she interviewed two generations of Australian men, which was a nice comparison, and found that millennial men, so 20 to 35, are more likely to express positive forms of masculinity, demonstrating more loving homosociality, so friendship, and caring masculinity. So we know that historically caring has been coded as a feminine trait. Carla Elliott, in addition, along with Steve Roberts at Monash, they have written about caring masculinities and the idea that there's more ways to be a man these days, I guess, and more ways to be in touch with emotions. So there has been some discourse around that, and often, again, that gets used in the media in really simplistic ways. So a progress narrative. Young men are better now. They're more feminist. They're more caring, etc. On the other hand, there's often a lot of discourse around toxic masculinity. And indeed, the empirical research points to this as well. So we had some empirical research before that points towards kind of progress narratives. There's also research that points towards ongoing negative masculinity. So, for example, I've used this Attitudes Matter survey. I think it's a really interesting snapshot. Almost half of young Australian men agree that it's common for sexual assault accusations to be used as a way of getting back at men. So we see some persistent myths, gendered myths, which are generally much more believed by young men than young women. Actually, at Western Sydney Uni, the Challenging Racism Project, I was involved in a survey about conspiracy theories and misinformation, and we found that, unsurprisingly, men were more likely than women to believe certain myths about family law, family courts, sexual violence and gender-based violence than women. So we still see a gendered issue around men's attitudes to different types of violence and their sort of structural place in the world. I think for me, the most alarming discourses that we see, and it comes up again and again, is this idea of a crisis in masculinity. It's such a nice headline. And I think a crisis in masculinities discourse. Now, this has been going forever. When I was first teaching, there was this idea that boys weren't doing as well as girls in schools. This is a crisis in masculinity. And it always is a relational discourse. Girls are doing well, boys are doing more badly as a result. This relationality, it's always a zero-sum game. Conservatives love to latch onto this crisis in masculinity discourse. So, for example, the Washington Examiner just recently had a "young men are falling behind" headline. And they listed these bits of evidence that they'd cherry-picked out of context. So they listed all of this research and said the young men, have no friends, pornography addictions, academically behind women and girls. So again, that relationality, unable to find a partner, again, women. And there's a cultural hostility to male spaces that's making young men have a kind of crisis. So you can see there that it's kind of inching towards blame of women and progress and feminism, even if it's couched in quite reasonable terms. The Economist, this kept coming up in my Instagram feed. I don't know if I've been saying gender too much, but my Instagram feed kept bringing this story from the Economist up, why young men and women are drifting apart. And again, a research project that showed divergent worldviews among young men and women globally. They kind of had cherry-picked, and then they kind of reached conclusions and corollaries from that research that I maybe wouldn't have around the reasons for this divergence. And I think it's really important to go to academia, and the nuanced messages we can get from careful academic research doesn't jump to conclusions, to think about these problems carefully, to avoid falling into these pitfalls. So, the Economist, the article felt quite reasonable until it got to this little quote. Not all male grumbles are groundless. In some countries, divorce courts tend to favour the mother in child custody disputes. So this really out of context statement about favouring the mother, rather than really looking into the very complex history of custody and gender. So in academia, there's actually much more nuance in people's analyses. So I presented quite meanly, Brittany Ralph, at the beginning in terms of progress narratives of young men. But what she actually found, if you read the book properly, is that even when young men or millennial men, so not that young anymore, I'm an elder millennial, so that's depressing. Even when millennial men were challenging masculinity, being more caring, more touchy-feely with their friends, they almost ubiquitously used remasculinizing strategies when they performed progressive masculinities. So in her words, diverging from a masculinist subject position still invoked a sense of risk and vulnerability for the men in my study. She gave the examples that they would joke around when they did it. So it was like they might kiss on the lips, but it would then be like, like a bit of a joke. They did it, but it was not just like kissing on the lips to say goodbye. It usually had a joke around it. Giving each other shit, using excessive swearing. And then even when they were performing more feminine friendships of like giving advice, relationship advice, it tended to be much more like rational problem solving than just sharing. So Brittany Ralph cautions against the collapses of these discourses such as the crisis of masculinity. She talks about the way that the visibility of people like Jordan Peterson and Andrew Tate means that we are now seeing discourses in the media of a crisis of masculinity once again. and that they're leveraging those ideas of crisis in masculinity to then tap that kind of vulnerability of young men who feel like they're in a crisis to kind of recruit them to this misogynistic worldview. So indeed, when I went in the very rigorous search engine of Google News and searched young men masculinity, almost all the stories were about the manosphere, which I'll come to in a moment, or the online context of misogyny and traditional or negative masculinity. If I would have done this maybe 15 years ago, it would have been maybe a crisis in masculinity because of body image. That was a big one. I remember when Russell Brand was first famous, there was a big discourse that men were in a crisis because of the beauty expectations. So these discourses really shift and the media really jumps on to them. So I've talked about the way that these ideas are kind of reductive, but I want to make sure I'm going to describe the manosphere in a moment, talk about some of the issues with the online space for young men and masculinities and some of the figureheads like Andrew Tate that you might have heard of. But I think it's really important to realize that there's some really amazing work in masculinity studies, or it's usually called CSMM, Critical Studies in Men and Masculinities, that's really trying to challenge these collapses in logic. So I think a really good example of this is Andrea Walling. So she wrote this book, White Masculinity in Contemporary Australia, that talks about how we have to get the balance of structure and agency right. So in sociology, it's one of our favorite things to talk about and teach from the first year onwards is that, we have volition, we have our capacity to make change and make decisions as people, but we're in society and we're shaped by structures and discourses and all different things. Masculinity studies can sometimes collapse into those. Either men are completely oppressed by terrible masculine norms, or they are toxic and they are completely responsible for all of their behaviors. So this quote from Andrea, I think, really nicely encapsulates her position, which is that it's prudent to move beyond stagnant theorizations of men and masculinity as being only either victims of or responsible to various models of masculinities and masculine practices. So it seems really obvious, probably to everyone in the room, but men are both agentic and shaped by the context that they're in, like everyone in society. But I think it's just important to keep coming back to that and keep remembering that when we talk about young men, masculinity, and violence. So I want to talk now a little bit about this contemporary context of the manosphere and what's going on there. And with all of this stuff in mind about contemporary studies in men and masculinity, critical studies in men and masculinity, I want to come back at the end to thinking about how some of these things might be challenged in nuanced ways that don't collapse back into some of those positions and really take the lead of this kind of much more complex theory from academia. So let's talk about the delightful manosphere then. It's kind of the thing that media is really talking about a lot at the moment, and it's really shaping a lot of people's lives. It's really prevalent in both mainstream discourse and elsewhere. So it's become a bit of a focus of my research, maybe because I was a victim to early men's rights advocate bullying really early in my career. So just to give you a definition, the Manosphere is a name that's been given to a loosely connected group of anti-feminist internet communities. So there's considered to be kind of a lot of content online that is anti-feminist, geared towards men, and geared towards kind of disgruntled men who feel that they are maybe discriminated against in some way. And I guess that probably the biggest spokesperson of this world now is probably Andrew Tate. Kind of can't swing a cat without hearing about him. So I've put this image at the bottom right of this guy, Paul Elam, because he was one of the first people to start a kind of online space for disgruntled men. And he started a website for men's rights activists. And in the early noughties, when I was doing my PhD, randomly, him and a bunch of friends decided, or like colleagues, decided that they would take the names of all of these women who had presented at a feminist conference and start emailing us with abuse and threats and sharing our email address online, which is called doxing, and telling our employers that we were spreading hate speech and wanted to eradicate the male race. So that was a real induction for me into this online world that I'd never heard of. So he started the MRA website, and they considered themselves to be activists, addressing a real social problem. And they really framed this as a really rational position in the early days. So that's MRAs. From there, various subgroups emerged. MGTOW, it stands for Men Going Their Own Way, was a group of, an idea, I guess, and a group of men online who used kind of very similar discourses to feminist lesbian separatism, only without the sex. They decided that given how oppressive women were over men in contemporary society, and how privileged women were, and how oppressed they would be in a heterosexual relationship, that they would have nothing to do with women anymore. Hence this little image on the bottom right. Then in a different way, taking the same premise but taking it in a different direction, was the kind of pickup artist movement that had a moment. There was a guy who started a group called Return of Kings, and that was about learning how to pick up women, how to play the game, how to get game, how to work out how to pick up women and get the sex to which you were entitled. So there was a real sense that there was a male entitlement that had been lost, and that young men, or that men in general, need to learn how to get it. On the other end of that spectrum, and much more, I think much more well known in mainstream media these days, is the idea of incel, which are involuntary celibates. So this is when young men who feel oppressed by contemporary gender dynamics, can't access the sex to which they feel they are entitled with women specifically, they identify themselves as involuntary celibates. And there's a lot of talk there about the kind of hierarchies of masculinity, that there's certain men who have the traits that get women and that they don't, so they're beaters or whatever, and so they are involuntary celibates. I guess the red pill is, I'm really sorry if I'm telling you all things that you already know. The red pill is a kind of idea adopted from the Matrix of the blue pill or the red pill, that if you take the red pill, you can see the truth. And I think really explains their worldview of a lot of the manosphere, which is that there's this truth, the kind of big conspiracy that feminism is a big conspiracy that is trying to change gender dynamics to the extent that women are in charge and that women are now the oppressor. And that if you've taken the red pill, you can see that and you become part of this world. And then on the most extreme end, I guess, black pill is a nihilistic version of incel, which advocates for maybe suicide of young men because they're worthless, or for violence. So, yeah, fun. So some of the key traits of the manosphere, they share a lot of these spaces share a few things. And more or less explicitly, there's a kind of idea of male supremacy, or at least male dominance, that there's a natural kind of position for men in the world, and that feminism and women are maybe trying to override that. I think some people would talk about themselves as like equalists, but I think that underpinning that is actually an idea of male dominance. Anti-feminism is universal, so that is the idea that feminism, a caricature of feminism as the desire for women to have power over men. I think that comes out in teaching. I don't know if any of you have experienced this, if you're academic teachers in the room, that students will sometimes ask, why isn't it humanism? Why isn't it equalism? And usually I ask another student to answer, and they will say, because we live in a gender unequal world, quite simply put. But that caricature of feminism is wanting to tip the scales. Traditional norms of masculinity are fairly rife throughout this stuff of the protector, the father, and usually quite heterosexual. Elected victimhood is really the emotional core of all of this. The idea that men are the victims of a social structure, social world, or culture that is against them. So that story we saw before from the Washington something or other, which was talking about a cultural context that's hostile to young men. They really leverage that idea that they're now the victims of false accusations of sexual assault, for example. And then finally, there's a pretty strong overlap with other types of right-wing extremism, perhaps racism, and so on. So it's really nicely summarized here by R. James, who has written a paper just this year about the victim narratives in the Manosphere, who says that it's a combination of pre-existing anti-feminist narratives with a biological essentialist worldview, so the idea that there's an essence of manhood, and conspiratorial logic. In Australia, it takes a specific flavour because about the kind of makeup of our society, I guess. So there's been a couple of, studies in Victoria on the overlaps of the Manosphere and right-wing extremism. And Lewis, who was looking at gender in far-right politics in Victoria, found that there was ultra-nationalist discourse, anti-migrant, unsurprisingly, we have a lot of discourse around migration, anti-Islam, pro-traditional heroic masculinity, and generally a vibe of being anti-progressive. So against progressive people and ideas like multiculturalism and environmentalism, often called things like social justice warriors. And then also key to this is a tendency to be quite supportive of violence and militancy. Again, the Challenging Racism project here at Western Sydney in the study we did on conspiracy theories and misinformation found another correlation between people who are likely to have to believe myths around gender also had a likelihood to support violence and militancy and be less democratic in their worldviews. So another report on Victoria specifically, Victoria seemingly giving all the funding for this. If there's anyone from the New South Wales government here and they want to fund a project, that would be great. A project myself, Chris Aegis at K Cook undertook. We analysed both Victorian YouTube content and we spoke to frontline workers, and we found that there is a general vibe of believing in hierarchy, order, power, tradition. This victim belief that the system is working against men, and then this idea of relative deprivation, the idea that minorities and women are benefiting at men's expense. So it's this zero-sum logic that comes through in the media as well, that really underpins a lot of this aggrievement in the manosphere. I really like this idea from Simon Copland, who's an Australian scholar, who says there's a reason that these kind of ideas cross-pollinate, I guess, which is that both groups, the far right and the manosphere, argue that society has been feminized. This feminization, caused by the changes brought about by feminism, both argue, has not only weakened men, but weakened society overall. So, violence. I think another thing that we need more research on, but there's emerging research about, is to what extent does the manosphere create or accelerate violence? Or what overlap is there with violence? That's a really hard thing to measure, but people are increasingly trying to find that data. There's a lot of assumptions, again, in the media, there's a lot of assumptions that kind of Andrew Tate's discourse online is going to make young men violent or make them be more violent. And I think that's a fair assumption, but again, we probably need pretty good evidence to talk about that. We know there's links. So at the basic minimum, we can say that a lot of people who have perpetrated public acts of violence, a lot of men who have perpetrated public acts of violence have had links with the manosphere, have accessed manosphere content. So, for example, Elliot Rodger, who injured 14 and killed 7, and Alec Minassian, who killed 10 and injured 16, they are all known to have participated in the manosphere in some way. So whether that's incel or whatever. And we also know that various kind of statements written by perpetrators of public violence have made reference to incel ideas about gender, about being oppressed as a young man. So we know public violence is connected with the manosphere. In terms of intimate violence, the extent to which it either exacerbates, creates, or just correlates with intimate violence, so family violence and so on, very little evidence. Josh Thorburn, who is an excellent emerging scholar in Australia. He has some very emerging data. He looked at a Reddit called two Reddits, Incel Exit and X Red Pill. So these are for people to talk about leaving the manosphere. And he found that ex or current partners of manosphere participants stated that their partners began or escalated their intimate partner violence after engagement in the manosphere. So some of these hunches can be backed up. Additionally, I think it's really heartening to see that we are seeing conceptual links in public discourse between misogyny, domestic violence, and public violence targeting women. So, for example, the Saturday paper had a story earlier this year called The Misogyny Killings. So these conceptual links are being made. In terms of data about men who use domestic and family violence, and the extent to which they use or seek out anti-feminist discourse, very little out there again. So in the project I undertook for the Victorian government a few years ago with my colleague Chris Aegis, we actually did open-ended, like long-form surveys with frontline practitioners who work with men who use domestic and family violence, because we had a hunch that probably these discourses, just from having conversations with men's behavior change practitioners, we had a hunch that men who use domestic and family violence probably were finding solace in the kind of ideas from the manosphere, or were using it to rationalize some of their behaviors. So most of the people we surveyed were men's behavior change practitioners. So they work often with men who have been mandated to do a course in men's behavior change because of using violence against a partner or family member. We will ask them if any right-wing extremist ideas or anti-feminist ideas came up with the men they do group or one-on-one therapy with. They said that we were interested in backlash, the manosphere, and violence and the connections between those. In terms of what we found then, firstly, we found that practitioners who worked with men who use violence said that they hear a lot of discourses about traditional gender roles, I guess, and attitudes towards women. So a lot of men talk about women being weaker than men and that a man should be the head of the family. So an example of that discourse is, I put meat on the table, she needs to take care of the kids in the house. Other phrases that came up are women being in their place, tending to my needs, and then ideas about objectifying women. In terms of actual explicit anti-feminism, this is a key quote, I guess, that summarizes most of the attitudes. Those men who have mentioned feminism do so to vent about men's rights being restricted and that women are getting more power, men are being ignored and blamed or victimized. So whether they're getting this from the manosphere or not, men are indeed using a lot of the same ideas that the manosphere tends to spread. So when asked what sentiment men expressed about feminism, these are some of the answers we got. Telling men what to do, feminazi, dykes, bitches and ball breakers, man-hating, or reducing our rights. So almost always feminism was expressed, according to these practitioners, the men they work with expressed feminism as anti-men. So whilst some research suggests that young men are more likely to understand what feminism really is, this research tells us that the men in these change programs, most of whom are a bit older, still think of feminism in this way. So this can kind of, in terms of conceptualizing it, this is not the most groundbreaking thing, but I think it's really easy to just go back to this classic work that was written in 1993 about backlash. And I think going back to it has been really interesting for me in terms of how much it still fits. So Susan Faludi wrote this book, Backlash, in 1993, talking about the way that, women's entering the workforce created a kind of backlash with narratives that, women can't have it all and that feminism is a disaster. So she conceptualized backlash as an attempt to retract the handful of small and hard-won victories that the feminist movement did manage to win for women, triggered by the perception that women are making great strides and blaming women and feminism for felt or real threats that men experience. So again, that victimhood, that emotional sense of loss. And Faludi calls this a sense of masculine doom, which I think is very poetic. Additionally, I would also conceptualize of this kind of idea as coming from and being allowed by an underpinning masculinist ethos. So I really like this idea because it allows us to understand the sort of ideology of gender that underpins our society, beyond just people being men and women and doing masculinity and femininity. Masculinism is a concept that allows us to think about the worldviews and how gendered our worldviews are. So in 2018, Chris Aegis and I defined masculinism as an underlying ethos or totalizing worldview that implicitly universalizes and privileges the qualities of masculinity. So what we mean by that is anything that's coded as masculine is better, superior, and in doing so subordinates an other's alternative ways of understanding, knowing, and being. So another person who uses masculinism is Wendy Brown, who in talking about politics talks about masculinist power rather than the power of men. It allows us to analyze gender dynamics beyond individuals. And I think really this all just comes back to some real classic feminist theorizing. So I'm a really big fan of Simone de Beauvoir, who wrote this book, The Second Sex, in 1949, who was conceptualizing this exact idea, that in society, men are the default subject, she says the absolute, and woman is the other to this default subject. I think we're still seeing that play out now. And when women stop being that other, there's a kind of uproar against that. I think that's a really nice way of seeing all of this. Back to the data then, other forms of discrimination. We asked practitioners, do other forms of discrimination come up? Is there disgruntlement or negative attitudes towards other types of people? So one quote here, the men who are in men's behaviour change groups may scoff or get angry at the group facilitators who are doing an acknowledgement of country. So again, we see that connection with the kind of anti-social justice warrior idea. They may speak about women as liars or as men being the real victims, feminism is going too far, and then similar sentiments are said in racial terms, that really it's white men that are now oppressed. So we're seeing those same ideas come out by men who use domestic and family violence. In terms of when we asked who the target of this disgruntlement or anger was, answers were Aboriginal people, Muslims, Black people, African gangs, that's a very specifically Australian discourse, gender identity politics, and bloody greenies or lefties. And I think this really speaks back to this idea of masculinism, because the concept of masculinism isn't just about gender, it's an ethos of hierarchy. So I'm going to quote Chantal Ledouf here, who says that when they talk about masculinism, they mean both the assertion of masculine dominance over the feminism, but also the practice of taking this first superiority as a point of reference to assert other forms of supremacy. So it's disparaging other people, otherness, from this universal subject of the white man. So coming back to the emotional kind of context of where this anti-feminism is coming from, this disgruntlement is coming from, the overarching findings we found in this research was this idea of a system against men, that men are feeling, especially when they have had to experience some kind of loss, such as loss of custody, or the loss of their partner, or indeed having to go and do men's behaviour change, that they feel like there's a conspiracy of a system that is against them. And as the quote at the bottom says, repackages the personal experiences and individual shortcomings of men as part of a larger feminist conspiracy to harm them. So men were looking for a narrative to explain what was happening to them, and they found it in the idea of a system that's against them, which is the same idea that's coming through on the manosphere. So, for example, women are already equal, and any more reforms or movements to support women mean that men are treated badly and unfairly in the new systems. There's an idea that the system is heavily weighted on the female side. This chart on the right was when we asked what or who is or are the main targets of anger or disgruntlement for the men you work with, partner or ex-partner, so it's individualized in some way, then the family court, child protection, legal system, the system, and the system that's against men, so we can combine those. I think this is a really interesting insight, and actually coming back to the way that there's an emotional aspect to this. Feminism in the second wave talked about this idea that personal is political. Second wave feminism allowed women to take individual experiences that they were having and realize that it was a gendered thing that other women, other people were experiencing, that was to do with a gender unequal society. So women who were feeling oppressed in the home, experiencing family violence, when they came together and raised the consciousness about the gendered world, realized that the personal is political. Men are using that same idea and discourse, but with a basis of misinformation and making those same kind of emotional affective claims that feminism did and that was so effective. So men's feelings, then, there's so much feelings going on here. I think I want to talk to you about, I'm going to start with this chart here, that the feelings are coming out at these times of particular loss, I guess. So when we ask, are there any particular events, experiences, or processes that seem to trigger more radical sentiments, like with the table before, our respondents said there was either no triggering events, law courts, men as victims, or men feeling monitored or losing their rights. So it's lacking, having something that they think is theirs taken away from them. And I think most alarmingly, we see the logic play out here because one participant said, one man said that more women need to die at the hands of men so that the system understands that men are in crisis and need help. And this is such an alarming sentiment and so enlightening about what is going on and what needs to be tackled in order to kind of prevent this epidemic, I guess, of violence against women. And again, we see this playing out in public violence. So the Bondi shopping center killer's father said about him, he wanted a girlfriend and he's got no social skills and he was frustrated out of his brain. One key issue is that these ideas, these feelings, these affective centers of agreement are being supported by misinformation. So some of the misinformation that came up in our surveys is that male suicide is caused by feminists. Due to feminism, men are killing themselves and being taken away from their children. And we found that men were talking about various online ideas, which I've listed in the table below. So misinformation is a real problem, and it makes men's affective claims seem reasonable. A lot of this misinformation has been debunked. Some of the fake stats, like this 21 father stat, has been challenged. This 1 in 3 stat that you can look up has been challenged as well. So in terms of how this is addressed then, the problem is that in the absence of any really good, effective solutions, people are turning to something that helps them make sense of it. So the kind of return of King's logic, the kind of idea that men are losing their masculinity. How do we get it back? Well, we have to turn to people like Andrew Tate to see how we can be self-made men, get back what's rightfully ours. I'm shamelessly, I saw that Stephanie is in the house. I'm going to briefly speak about some research that hasn't been published yet, but we just submitted an article that was an analysis of some of Andrew Tate's more long-form discourse on his own platforms to talk about how he can kind of scaffold these ideas for young men. That his long-form ideas, outside of the sound bites that we might see on YouTube, are more subtly about building a particular form of masculinity and manhood that then allows for and scaffolds the corollaries of more extreme misogyny. So he makes this really self-made man narrative that men can actually get back what is theirs through physicality, aggression. He talks about combat a lot, training and discipline. And then men can get wealth, power, and that their rightful role as protector of women. Really tapping these traditional masculine things that are being challenged when men are, for example, in family law court or men's behaviour change. So the problem is, I think we need to challenge a lot of the kind of discourses of equivocation that we see in the media that are more moderate men's rights discourses that uphold the really dangerous misogynistic ideas. So Andrew Tate is an example. It's not moderate, but some of his ideas in the background seem moderate, and I can see how they can be an entry point for young men to be exposed to more misogynistic extreme ideas. And these more moderate ideas are also seen in mainstream media. So, for example, we see a lot of ideas that male students are being targeted because we are believing women's word about sexual violence. And therefore exacerbating kind of post-feminist take. And this is kind of, this moderate form of anti-feminism is dangerous because it as Van Alinen says here, it facilitates infiltration into everyday understandings about gender, feminism, and societal power. Whew, so I'm rushing because I want to move on to the idea that there's a real necessity to think about these things with nuance and complexity, to understand backlash and men's feelings, to take men's feelings seriously without affirming them and without colluding in them. This is something that young men have, that men's behaviour change practitioners, professionals in the field of men's violence have long grappled with and are really great at. And I think we need to listen to them. So when I spoke recently in another project to people who work with young men who use intimate partner violence, they know that it's really important to realize the context. A lot of young men are coming from trauma. They may be both victims and perpetrators. Young men are more aware of feminism and the range of violence, and they find both positive and negative content on social media, but they don't respond well to being lectured or stigmatized. So the practitioners I spoke to had a really nuanced understanding of the position of young men, the difficult kind of contexts that they're coming from, and an empathy for young men and sitting with them and their trauma, whilst also gently challenging their ideas. So I really like the way that this participant who works with young men who use intimate partner violence spoke to me about possible ways to address it. He said, I would go after the stigma first and think about how we think about people who use violence and seeing if we're not dehumanizing them. There's always the other, and then instead of those of us. And I think it's a very painful subject matter for us to talk about family violence in comparison from a man to a female, because it's such a brutally unfair moment of physical stuff that it's very hard for us to have a nuanced conversation about it. These still are people who are committing these acts of violence. So he's able in this statement to both evoke the fact that gender-based violence is a brutally unfair moment, in that men using violence against women is a gendered phenomenon, but that these are still people using this violence without undermining that feminist analysis. And I found practitioners are really able to sit with their feminist analysis whilst not dehumanizing. So a closing thought then is that I think it's really, really important to realize that whilst we want to think about the emotions, the humanizing of these young men who are accessing this and the feelings that they have, that we need to remember as well that gender doesn't play out in the same way for men and women. So I love this quote that I bring up every time I do a presentation, which is that on a global level, many societies still suffer under the offense of undesirable masculinity, and an unmitigated or overdeveloped masculinity can be destructive. Negative femininity, on the other hand, mostly affects just the individuals who display it. So next time you hear somebody saying feminism hates men, it's on this quote. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Lucy. That was amazing. We might go to question time now. We've had questions coming through in the chat, so we might just track back to those. And Keith has said, has there been any research into the levels of autism spectrum disorder into the members of the Manosphere? As a former red pillar, cringe, getting my ASD or DD diagnosis was a big part of realizing I was prone to black-white thinking and was seeking online community in the absence of undeveloped social skills, which I have since successfully built with the help of my therapist. Wonderful presentation so far, Lucy. Love your work. Do you want me to read them all and then you can address as you wish, or one by one?
Maybe one by one, because I won't remember.
Okay.
Amazing. Thank you for sharing. That's such an interesting insight, the idea of black and white thinking. I think that is a fascinating direction. I will say I don't know if there's any research, but I would say, why don't you do some research? Call me. We can collaborate. Because I think that's a really interesting thing, that there's a vulnerability in terms of black and white thinking of looking for a very cohesive ideology. I think that's really, really, really interesting. So just thank you is all I want to say about that.
Okay, next we have Emily Wolfinger, who says, can you speak to the links between the manosphere, radicalization and gaming? So many young men and boys seem to come across these ideas via gaming and YouTube. And Emily also says, also, why are some men so disgruntled? Beyond backlash and radicalization, are there real reasons or needs here that we need to consider?
with the gaming thing, I mean, so much of the Manosphere stuff blew up around what's called Gamergate. So you can totally Google that. I don't have the capacity to talk about that. I'm not a gamer. I'm not enough of an expert to talk about that. But yes, the gaming culture has just tended to be a bit of a breeding ground for these ideas. So I totally agree. In terms of the disgruntlement, I hope I spoke to that later. Well, no, you messaged quite near the end. But I think that's the problem, right? Is that it's really hard to talk about some of the problems of contemporary masculinity. Like, it's not hard. It's not easy to be a young man. But I think it's really hard to talk about those without accidentally being either captured into or collapsing into anti-feminist discourse or really simplistic ideas of the crisis in masculinity. So I think what we really need is more of those complex voices that are able to say, yes, it's really crap to be a man. Gender is bad for men too, but it's not feminism's fault, right? So I think that's the narrative we need to push. So I absolutely agree that there's real reasons to consider. Sorry, I'm trying to speed through.
Okay. So lots of thanks coming in for you as well. We have Felicity Joseph asking, what level of responsibility can adult men, as opposed to young men or youths, be expected to have for their own behaviour and for changing the culture? It feels like only a handful of men have put their hands up to do so.
Such a good point. And I think there's always been a bit of a culture of pro-feminist men or feminist men doing the work. And I think one of the takeaways as well is I think it is men's job to do the work, right? I grew up in the kind of punk scene, and I know that in our community, men had their own like discussion groups about gender. What a utopia. And actually a lot of those men that I grew up being friends with have become men's behaviour change practitioners, which is how I got interested in it. So I think, yes, we should expect men to read, research, and do a lot of that work of challenging culture themselves. Look, in men's behaviour change, the standard practice is to have a man and a woman facilitator in a room because of the worry of collusion by men, accidental collusion. If you act too matey, it can come across like you're affirming some of the pro-violence attitudes. So there's often a woman in the room as well. And it's also considered best practice to role model good relationships between men and women, that men and women can work together as equals, which I think is really cool. But yes, I think men need to be leading the change in that area. So yeah.
Okay. Next we have Sadia Adnan, who says, can we speak on the misogynistic attitude against the Muslim women of colour in Australian context? Has there been any recent research in that sphere?
Oh, such a good point. Honestly, I don't know specifically, but I do know that we found in our online content analysis that there is a massive amount of overlap between people spreading Islamophobia and people spreading anti-feminism, that they are both seen as part of a conspiracy to challenge traditional Western culture. And so I think one of the things I like to think about is kind of a coalitional way of challenging the ideas. And if we are all lumped together as the problem, then I think a coalitional response where subordinated groups come together to challenge it is a really important way of responding. It's probably the best I can give you. But again, I would say you should do that research. That sounds really good. I'll read it.
Next we have Chris Jordan Clark, who says, I'm interested in the idea of men thinking of themselves as protectors. Do they ever have any insight into who they are protecting women from? Has this ever been asked? Because women need protecting from other men. Do they realise this?
Yeah, so there's been some really good work about good man, bad man narratives. The work that really got me thinking about the concept of masculinism was this article by someone called Iris Marion Young. She's a kind of political theorist, and she writes about the logic of masculinist protectionism. And she says that it's kind of similar to the idea of benevolent sexism, that men invoke this idea of being needing to protect people as a way to uphold their power and their way to uphold othering of other groups as well. So on a kind of international level, you might think of the invasion of Afghanistan, the way that gender was leveraged in that to protect those kind of brown women from brown men. That's how it's been put in the scholarship. But on the interpersonal level, it's kind of the idea that you need to protect your partner from the bad men out there, your woman from the bad men out there, but you're a good man, without realizing the kind of masculinist ideology that underpins that. So I think that idea of protection comes through so strongly, and the Andrew Tate data that Steve Roberts and Stephanie Westacott were leading has shown that that's a really prevalent discourse with Andrew Tate as well.
We have a comment from Sam Schultz. Funnily enough, I'm interviewing SA teachers at the moment about what is happening at the chalk face, and many have mentioned the high susceptibility to the manosphere of young men or boys broadly identifying as neurodiverse. So that's more of a comment.
Can I just jump in there though and say,
yeah.
you should reach out to Keith, you should collaborate, and you should do some awesome work. I'm academic matchmaking.
Then we have Lewis Robledo, saying, I find a connection between this presentation and your recent article titled Whose Concerns? Young Adults Discussing Their Concerns with Pornography. Could you discuss how these influences might also impact young people's attitudes towards pornography and how these attitudes may contribute to the spread of these extremist ideas? How do you think the implementation of more effective education about pornography could mitigate the problematic notions of masculinity promoted by the Manosphere figures?
Such a good question. I would say a lot of the people I spoke to who work with young people in my most recent project, who work with young men who use intimate partner violence in general, say that in Australia we have to get over this culture war around teaching prevention of gender-based violence, that we need to talk properly about consent and about gender in schools when people are younger. They're just so keen for us to get beyond the politicization of all of these topics in Australia. And I don't know, Louise, if it's the same in Spain. But, you know, we keep politicizing this stuff, which means that young people aren't getting the information that or like the critical capacity to think about these things that they need. So it's the same problem, right? The way that consent and porn is thought about, same problem as the way that violence is thought about, because we're just not giving the critical capacities to young people. We're not respecting them because of the goddamn culture wars that mean that we're constantly having to backtrack on programs, withdraw consent teaching in schools. Like, I see some education scholars in the room, you know way more about this than me, but you know, wisdom gets lost. Programs that were funded are no longer funded. It's chaos in that sector, I'm sure. So it's the same thing, I think. We need to respect adults as children, or young people rather, as people who can be trusted to be equipped with critical thought about all of these topics, rather than a silence or a milkshake advert about consent. Louise, I'll send you that advert. You won't have seen it.
Okay. Rebecca Johnston asks, is there a reference list for the presentation, please?
I can make one and send it around happily if you want to read more. That would be amazing.
Anita King says, thanks so much for presenting your research and related other information. I'm agreeing with your early statement about sociology finding the problems, as I'm feeling sad and dark about the state of affairs, as there doesn't seem to be a clear way through to a healthy society. Is there anything you can add?
Look, I think whilst the internet is full of bad stuff, I think I also take solace from seeing really loads of cool stuff online from young people, and realizing that young people are also thinking in really complex and interesting ways and educating one another about those. You know, TikTok is a really good example of young people sharing really positive social change-based information. And I think there are really good examples of like pro-feminist men's groups of people challenging these ideas. So try not to be sad, Anita. You've got us. You've got all your colleagues at Western. We're all great.
Okay. Karen Hutchings says, Lucy, do you think the protection ideology also speaks to the idea of ownership of women? Men protect what they own.
Hell yeah. I think, you know, that patriarchal ideology of continuing your line. through women. You know, the idea that you have to protect, you need to know that your woman isn't mating with anyone else, so you know those children are yours and you're not wasting your resources on them. That whole history of patriarchal ownership of women is completely underpinning all of that and is naturalized in those ideas for sure. Truly worrying.
Okay, so we'll just quickly go through these last questions because I know we're nearly out of time. Bryony Walker says, I'm interested in the term masculinism, but is this just another word for misogyny? Would you mind expanding on this a little?
Such a good one. Definitely not a quick one. Such a good one. And I struggled with this myself. So when we were writing the book, we struggled really hard with, is this different from patriarchy? Is it different from misogyny? And with distinguishing the differences. I can totally send you the intro to the book where we tried to deal with it, and I would love your feedback because I think it's distinct insofar as if we define misogyny as hatred of women, masculinism is the more subtle beliefs that allow for that. That's how I conceptualize it, right? That it's like the subtle ideas that like man stuff is better than like stuff associated with men and masculinity is better. But I think there's an argument to be made as well that could just be in the definition of misogyny. And it's almost like I'm capitulating to the simplified idea of misogyny by making a new term rather than trying to problematize how people understand misogyny. Bryony, your thoughts?
I'd love to read the intro and the book. Yeah, I'm not sure. I did feel like a real intellectual surge reading of Brightness, like reading about masculinism. And I'm like, I think that does something really useful. I think it does because it is about preference rather than avoidance, like a moving towards something rather than a moving away. And it does feel different. And I also think that just decoupling these things from particular people and lives and thinking about them in terms of traits is really useful. I'm really interested in thinking about maybe what I would now think of as masculinism in queer communities. For example. But I also, so often I feel like so many things seem to just come back to misogyny. But I think we can have the nuance to say both of those things. I'm really interested in it. It seems really rich. Thank you.
Should we collab on a paper called Is Masculinism Really Misogyny? Done.
Sounds wonderful.
I'll email you.
Thank you.
And lastly, we have Ashley Gore responding for those asking how we motivate men. I think Bell Hooks wrote about this in The Will to Change, Men, Masculinity and Love, a very accessible read. So, yes, Linda Peach has shared the link to her article. Yeah. Okay.
It's not fun to be cut off from your emotions as a man. So maybe there's a motivation there. Like, you could be happier and healthier if you challenge traditional masculinity. But that's such a good example. Thank you, Ashley and Bryony.
Thank you, Lucy. On behalf of Western Sydney University Library and the Thought Leadership event series, thank you so much for speaking today.
Thanks for coming, everyone, for your time and comments. Please reach out. Bye.